In the spring of 1945, American soldiers defending a muddy ridge on Okinawa began killing Japanese infiltrators in total darkness, at distances that should have been impossible, with a weapon that officially did not exist. The enemy died without understanding what hunted them. Most of the men who fired those shots were sworn to silence. The weapons themselves were destroyed. For decades, this story vanished into classified archives, a footnote in the shadow of the atomic bomb. But on those rain-soaked nights, while the world's attention focused elsewhere, warfare changed forever. What you're about to hear is the true account of the first soldiers who could see in the dark, and the terrifying nights when that power turned the tide of the Pacific War's bloodiest battle. The night belonged to the Japanese. Every American rifleman on Okinawa knew this with the certainty of lived terror. From the moment the sun dropped below the horizon until the first gray light of dawn, the perimeter became a killing ground where visibility meant nothing and sound meant everything. The darkness was not merely an absence of light. It was thick, physical, oppressive, pressed against the eyes, filled the lungs. It transformed familiar terrain into alien geometry where distance collapsed and direction dissolved. A man could stare into that blackness until his eyes ached and see nothing, hear nothing, and then suddenly the night would erupt in screams and gunfire and the wet sounds of close combat. And when it ended, Americans would be dead in their foxholes, throats cut, sometimes mutilated, and the enemy would have melted back into the darkness like smoke. The Japanese had refined night infiltration into a deadly art. Their soldiers moved with patience that bordered on inhuman. They would begin their approach hours before the actual attack, crawling forward inches at a time, pausing for minutes between movements, synchronized with the wind and rain to mask any sound. They knew exactly how to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of defenders who had been staring into darkness for hours, whose nerves were scraped raw, whose trigger discipline eroded as exhaustion set in. They understood that American soldiers, trained in the doctrine of overwhelming firepower and aggressive maneuver, struggled with the terrible passivity of night defense, the forced stillness, the waiting. The Japanese exploited this. They would throw rocks to draw fire and reveal positions. They would whisper in English. They would imitate wounded men calling for medics. And when the Americans fired blindly into the darkness, muzzle flashes marked their positions like signal flares, and the infiltrators would close in on those exact spots. By April 1945, the battle for Okinawa had devolved into a grinding nightmare that made previous Pacific campaigns look almost clean by comparison. The island was a maze of coral ridges, caves, and fortified positions where Japanese forces had constructed the most sophisticated defensive network the Americans had yet encountered. Every yard forward cost blood. Every night brought infiltration. The casualties mounted with mathematical inevitability. American commanders calculated that at the current rate of attrition, the casualties would exceed those of Iwo Jima, would exceed those of any previous Pacific battle, and the end was nowhere in sight. The Japanese were fighting with suicidal determination, and they owned the night absolutely. Sergeant James Hartwell had stopped counting the nights. Somewhere around the third week, the nights had blurred together into one long darkness punctuated by sudden violence. He was 24 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania that felt like it belonged to another universe. He had landed on Okinawa with the first wave, had seen friends torn apart by artillery, had learned to sleep in mud, had discovered that fear was not something you overcame but something you carried like a second skeleton inside your body. He was not a hero. He was a tired man doing a terrible job because the alternative was death or desertion, and desertion was not really an alternative at all. His hands shook slightly all the time now. He had stopped noticing. The night infiltration had become routine in the way that horror can become routine. You dug in before dark. You set out trip wires, though the Japanese had learned to detect and avoid them. You arranged grenades within easy reach. You kept your rifle ready and your bayonet fixed. Then you waited. You did not smoke. You did not talk above a whisper. You listened to the rain if it was raining, which it usually was. You listened to your own breathing. You tried not to think about the man in the next foxhole over who had been found at dawn with his head nearly severed. You tried not to think about anything at all. And when something moved in the darkness, You had perhaps a second to decide whether to fire and reveal your position or to wait and possibly die in silence. Hartwell had fired into the darkness 11 times. He had no idea if he had ever hit anything. The darkness swallowed bullets without comment. The darkness gave nothing back. You fired where you heard movement or where you thought you heard movement, and then you rolled to a different position in your foxhole and waited to see if return fire came. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes you found bodies at dawn. Sometimes you found nothing but mud and your own spent brass and the certainty that you had wasted ammunition shooting at ghosts, except the ghosts were real and they killed men every single night. On the morning of April 19th, Hartwell was told to report to battalion headquarters. He assumed he was being reassigned or reprimanded or that someone in his family had died. The assumption of bad news was reflexive now. He walked through the rear area in a light rain, past rows of equipment, past medics loading wounded men into ambulances, past graves registration personnel doing their grim accounting. Battalion headquarters was a captured Japanese bunker, reinforced with sandbags, smelling of mildew and cigarettes and the coffee that officers always somehow managed to have. A lieutenant he didn't recognize told him to wait. He waited. The war was mostly waiting. After 20 minutes, he was brought into a smaller room where a captain sat behind a folding table covered with maps and a major stood smoking in the corner. There were 2 other sergeants present, both from different companies. Hartwell knew them by sight but not by name. Everyone looked exhausted. Everyone looked the same brand of exhausted. The captain looked up from his maps. "You men have been selected for a specialized night defense detail," he said without preamble. "You're going to be trained on a new weapon system. This system is classified. You will not discuss it with anyone outside this room. You will not mention it in letters home. You will not talk about it with men in your own unit. If you are captured, you will destroy the equipment and you will say nothing. This is not a request. Do you understand?" The 3 sergeants said they understood. They did not actually understand. The captain continued. "The weapon you're going to use will allow you to see enemy soldiers at night. They will not be able to see you. You will be able to engage targets in total darkness at ranges up to 70 yards. This technology is experimental. There are fewer than 150 units in the entire Pacific Theater, and most of those are still in transit. You are being issued this equipment because your positions have been subject to repeated night infiltration and because casualties in your sectors are unacceptable." Hartwell felt something that might have been hope or might have been disbelief. See at night. The idea seemed impossible. The major stepped forward. He was older, maybe 40, with the deliberate manner of an engineer rather than a combat officer. "What you're going to be shown is an infrared sniperscope mounted on an M1 Carbine," he said. "The system works by projecting a beam of infrared light, which is invisible to the naked eye, and then receiving the reflected light through a specially designed scope. The scope converts the infrared light into a visible green image. From your perspective, you will see a green illuminated field of view showing anything the infrared beam touches. The enemy will see nothing. No light. No indication they are being observed. They will be completely blind to you." The major gestured to a case on the floor. He opened it. Inside was a weapon that looked simultaneously familiar and alien. It was an M1 Carbine, a weapon Hartwell knew well, but it had been transformed into something else. Mounted on top of the barrel was a large cylindrical tube, perhaps 18 inches long and 4 inches in diameter, matte black with a rubber eyepiece at the rear. Underneath the barrel, clamped in place with metal brackets, was a rectangular battery packed the size of a hardcover book. Wires ran from the battery to the scope and to a smaller cylindrical device mounted parallel to the barrel, which the major identified as the infrared illuminator. The entire assembly looked heavy. It looked fragile. It looked like something from a science fiction magazine. "The scope is the T3, the major continued. "The complete system weighs approximately 6 pounds more than a standard carbine. Battery life is approximately 30 minutes of continuous use, less in cold or wet conditions. You have been issued 4 batteries per weapon. You will need to manage your power carefully. The effective range is 75 yards under ideal conditions. In practice, expect 50 to 60 yards in the field. The image will be grainy. Depth perception will be poor. You will need to learn to judge distance differently. The infrared illuminator has a narrow beam. You will need to scan your sector, not just point and shoot. This is not a weapon for rapid engagement. This is a weapon for patient, deliberate ambush. They trained for 3 hours. The training consisted of looking through the scope in a darkened bunker while a technician explained the controls and the limitations. There was a power switch. There was a focusing ring. There was a brightness adjustment that mostly didn't work. The image through the scope was green and ghostly and surprisingly clear in the controlled environment of the bunker. A soldier walked back and forth in the darkness at the far end of the space, and through the scope, Hartwell could see him as a bright green silhouette against a darker green background. It was deeply strange. It felt like cheating, like seeing through walls, like a magic trick that shouldn't work but did. The technician emphasized battery management, emphasized the need to turn off the system between scans to conserve power, emphasized that the infrared beam could be detected by another infrared scope, though the Japanese had no such technology. The technician did not emphasize how to actually shoot someone with the weapon because the assumption was that they already knew how to shoot, and the only difference was that now they could see the target. They were each issued one T3 Carbine. They were each issued for batteries. They were issued a carrying case that was supposed to protect the delicate electronics but looked like it would barely survive a stiff breeze. They were told that if the weapon was damaged, it could not be replaced. They were told that the weapon was worth more than they were. They signed papers acknowledging receipt of classified equipment. They signed papers acknowledging that they understood the penalties for disclosure. Then they were dismissed with orders to return to their units and to begin night operations immediately. Hartwell carried the weapon back to his position like it was made of glass. The other men in his platoon looked at it with suspicion and curiosity. He told them it was a new sniper scope and nothing more. They accepted this because soldiers accepted strange equipment all the time and because asking too many questions was a good way to get assigned to unpleasant details. He spent the afternoon familiarizing himself with the weight and balance. The weapon was front-heavy. The battery pack threw off the center of gravity. It was awkward to carry, awkward to shoulder, awkward to aim. He practiced bringing it up to his eye in his foxhole. He practiced switching it on and off. He practiced scanning left and right. He did this until it felt slightly less foreign and slightly more like an extension of his body. Darkness came like it always came. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with moisture and the smell of disturbed earth and distant smoke. Hartwell settled into his foxhole and arranged the T3 Carbine carefully on the sandbags in front of him. He had a standard M1 Carbine as backup. He had grenades. He had a canteen of water and a few hard crackers that tasted like cardboard. He had his fear, which was constant now, a low-grade buzz in his nerves. The man in the foxhole to his left was Private Miller, a kid from Ohio who talked too much during the day and went silent at night. The man to his right was Corporal Jensen, who never talked at all. Both of them knew Hartwell had some kind of special equipment. Neither of them knew what it did. Hartwell had told them he might see something they didn't and that if he fired, they should follow his tracers. That was all the coordination they had time for. The night deepened. The darkness became total. There was no moon. Cloud cover blocked the stars. Visibility was measured in inches. Hartwell waited an hour, then 2 hours. He listened to the small sounds of the night, the insects, the distant rumble of artillery, the closer sound of men breathing in nearby foxholes. He waited until his eyes ached from staring into nothing. Then he reached down and switched on the T3. The scope hummed faintly. He pressed his eye to the rubber eyepiece and the world transformed. The darkness remained, but now there was a circle of vision, perhaps 20 degrees across, filled with green light. The terrain in front of him appeared as if illuminated by some ghostly lamp. He could see the sandbags of the foxhole in front of his position. He could see the shattered trunk of a tree. He could see the uneven ground sloping down toward the Japanese lines. The image was grainy and flat, lacking the depth and color of daylight vision. But it was vision. After hours of blindness, it felt like a miracle. He scanned slowly left to right. Nothing. He scanned right to left. Nothing. He switched off the scope to conserve the battery. The darkness slammed back like a physical force. He repeated this pattern for the next hour. 30 seconds of scanning. 5 minutes of darkness. 30 seconds of scanning. 5 minutes of darkness. His neck began to ache from the unnatural posture required to look through the scope while keeping low in the foxhole. His right eye began to hurt from focusing on the green image. He saw nothing but empty terrain. He began to wonder if the intelligence about night infiltration in this sector had been wrong, if tonight would be quiet, if he was wasting the precious battery life on nothing. Then, at approximately 0200 hours, during one of his scans, he saw movement. It was perhaps 50 yards out, at the very edge of the scope's effective range. A shape, low to the ground, moving slowly from left to right. Hartwell's heart rate spiked. He forced himself to breathe slowly. He tracked the shape. Paused. It moved again. Another shape appeared behind it. Then another. 3 men crawling in single file using a shallow depression in the ground for cover. They moved with extraordinary discipline. They paused for long seconds between movements. They were heading toward a gap between Hartwell's position and Jensen's position to the right. A gap that had been identified as a likely infiltration route but was impossible to cover in darkness. Hartwell kept the scope trained on them. They were approximately 45 yards away now. They paused again. Through the green image, he could see that they were carrying rifles. He could see the shape of helmets. He could see that the lead man was slightly larger than the others. They began moving again. 40 yards. Hartwell slowly, carefully, shifted the carbine to center the lead figure in his sight picture. The weapon was still resting on the sandbags. He took a breath and held it. The figure paused, as if sensing something, though there was nothing to sense, no light, no sound, nothing to indicate that he was being watched. Hartwell squeezed the trigger. The carbine fired with its familiar sharp crack. Through the scope, he saw the lead figure jerk and collapse. The 2 figures behind him froze for a fraction of a second, then scattered, one left and one right. Hartwell tracked the one moving right and fired again. Mississippi. He fired a 3rd time. The figure went down. The 3rd figure had disappeared into a shell hole. Hartwell scanned frantically. Nothing. He waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The figure popped up, running hard to the left, trying to get out of what he must have assumed was the line of fire from a weapon that could somehow see him. Hartwell led the running figure and fired twice. The 2nd round hit. The figure stumbled and fell and did not move again. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 20 seconds. To Hartwell's left and right, Miller and Jensen had heard the shots but had seen nothing, fired at nothing, could only wait in blind confusion. Hartwell switched off the scope. His hands were shaking badly now. He had just killed 3 men. He was certain of it. He had watched them die in green light and they had never known what killed them. The silence of the night returned. There was no return fire. There were no screams. There was only darkness and the smell of gunpowder and Hartwell's own ragged breathing. At dawn, a patrol went forward to check the area. They found 3 Japanese soldiers dead in the positions where Hartwell had seen them fall. They found no other bodies. The spacing and locations matched Hartwell's description exactly. The platoon lieutenant came to Hartwell's foxhole and asked how he had managed to engage targets in total darkness with that kind of accuracy. Hartwell said he had seen movement and fired at sound and got lucky. The lieutenant looked at him for a long moment, looked at the T3 Carbine and said nothing more. Word spread quietly through the company that Hartwell had dropped 3 infiltrators in the dark without taking return fire. Men looked at him differently. Men looked at the weapon differently. No one asked direct questions because everyone understood that some things were not meant to be discussed. The next night, Hartwell killed 2 more Japanese soldiers. The night after that, another 3. Each engagement followed the same pattern. Patient scanning. Sudden appearance of enemy movement. Calm aimed fire. Figures collapsing in green light. Silence. The other soldiers equipped with T3 carbines in other sectors of the line reported similar results. The night infiltration attacks did not stop, but their effectiveness plummeted. Japanese soldiers who had moved with impunity in darkness were now dying at distances that should have been impossible for blind fire. They did not understand what had changed. They could not understand. There was no visible light, no sound of detection equipment, nothing to indicate that the Americans had developed some new capability. They simply began dying in the darkness, shot with precision that defied explanation. The psychological impact on the Japanese was severe. Soldiers who had relied on the cover of night, who had been trained to exploit American blindness, now faced an invisible threat they could not counter. Some infiltration attempts were abandoned halfway through when the lead man was killed by a shot that came from nowhere. Some units refused night missions entirely. Intelligence reports from captured prisoners mentioned rumors of American soldiers with supernatural abilities, with night vision like cats with magic weapons. The rumors were not entirely wrong. The impact on American morale was equally significant but in the opposite direction. Soldiers in sectors defended by T3 equipped marksmen slept more easily. Casualties from night infiltration dropped by more than 70% in those sectors. The terrible mathematics of attrition began to shift slightly in favor of the defenders. It was not enough to change the overall trajectory of the battle. Okinawa remained a grinding nightmare. But it was enough to save lives, to reduce the nightly terror, to give exhausted men a small edge in a fight where edges were measured in corpses. Hartwell continued his night vigil. By the third week of operations, he had killed 27 enemy soldiers. He knew the number because he counted. He did not know why he counted. Perhaps it was a way of making the killing real, of forcing himself to acknowledge what he was doing. The killing did not feel real in the moment. Through the green light of the scope, the figures were abstract, almost video game-like silhouettes that fell when he pressed the trigger. It was only later, in daylight, when he saw the bodies, that the reality asserted itself. They were men. They had faces. They had probably had families. He had killed them with a machine that let him see in the dark, and they had died without ever knowing they were being hunted. The batteries became a constant source of anxiety. Each battery lasted approximately 30 minutes of active use, but the degradation was unpredictable. Cold reduced battery life. Moisture reduced battery life. Age reduced battery life. Hartwell developed a system of rotating batteries, using each one partially and then switching to preserve maximum total operational time. He became obsessive about battery management. He marked each battery with scratches to indicate how much life it had left. He hoarded the batteries like they were more valuable than ammunition, which in a sense they were. A rifle without bullets was useless but at least functioned as a club. The T3 without power was worse than useless. It was dead weight and a waste of a weapon slot. On the night of May 2nd, Hartwell's careful battery management failed him. He was scanning his sector during what should have been a quiet period. Intelligence had suggested that Japanese forces were consolidating for a major assault elsewhere on the line, and his sector was expected to be inactive. He was halfway through a scan when he spotted movement much closer than usual. 15 yards. A cluster of perhaps 8 or 9 figures, moving in a tight group, crawling rapidly toward his position. This was not a standard infiltration. This was a close assault team, probably tasked with breaching the line and creating chaos in the rear area. They were almost on top of him. Hartwell fired immediately, dropping the lead figure. He fired again, dropped another. The group scattered but did not retreat. They began rushing forward, abandoning stealth for speed. Hartwell fired 3 more rounds in rapid succession. 2 more figures went down. Then, in the middle of his 6th shot, the image in the scope flickered. The green light dimmed. The battery was dying. Panic hit him like cold water. He had perhaps 5 seconds of power left. He could see 4 or 5 figures still moving, now within 10 yards. He fired at the closest shape. The scope died completely. Darkness swallowed everything. He dropped the T3 Carbine and grabbed his standard M1, firing blind into the area where he had last seen movement. To his left and right, Miller and Jensen opened fire, alerted by Hartwell's shooting. Grenades detonated. Muzzle flashes lit the night in brief snapshots. Hartwell saw a Japanese soldier 5 feet in front of his foxhole, illuminated for a fraction of a second by a grenade blast, and he fired point blank. The figure went down. Another figure appeared from the right. Hartwell swung the carbine and fired again. The bolt locked back. Empty. He dropped the rifle and pulled his pistol and fired twice into the darkness. Someone screamed. Something heavy hit the sandbags in front of him. He fired 3 more times at the sound. His pistol slide locked back. Empty. He drew his bayonet and waited, breathing hard, completely blind, waiting for something to come over the sandbags and into his foxhole. Nothing came. The shooting stopped. The grenades stopped. The night returned to silence except for the sound of someone crying in Japanese, wounded, somewhere close. Hartwell remained frozen, bayonet in hand, waiting for dawn. His heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst. His hands were slick with sweat despite the cold. He could smell blood. He could smell powder smoke. He could smell mud and shit and fear. He stayed in that position, knife ready, until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the darkness. When there was enough light to see, he looked over the sandbags. There were 6 Japanese soldiers dead within 15 feet of his foxhole. 2 had been killed by the T3 Carbine before the battery died. 4 had been killed in the subsequent close-range firefight. One of them was draped across the sandbags directly in front of Hartwell's position, close enough that Hartwell could have reached out and touched him. The man's eyes were open. He was young. He had a photograph tucked into his uniform pocket. Hartwell did not look at the photograph. Miller was alive, shaken but unhurt. Jensen had taken a bayonet wound to the shoulder but would survive. 2 other soldiers in nearby positions had been killed in the assault. The Japanese had been attempting a coordinated breach along a 300-yard section of line. The breach had failed, largely because Hartwell had identified and disrupted the assault team before it could reach its jump-off point. If the battery had lasted another 60 seconds, he might have killed all of them before they closed the distance. If the battery had died 30 seconds earlier, the assault team would have overrun his position and possibly broken through the line. Hartwell was given a replacement battery. He was told that battery production was improving and that more consistent power cells were in development. He was told that he had done well. He did not feel like he had done well. He felt like he had nearly died because of a mechanical failure in a piece of experimental equipment that the enemy did not even know existed. He felt exhausted. He felt like the war would never end. He went back to his foxhole and waited for night to come again. The Battle of Okinawa continued until late June. The T3 Carbines remained in service throughout, operated by a small cadre of specially selected soldiers who were rotated periodically to prevent burnout. The technology proved its value repeatedly. Estimates suggested that the T3 equipped marksmen were responsible for killing more than 400 Japanese soldiers in night engagements and for preventing dozens of successful infiltration attacks. The reduction in American casualties was statistically significant. The program was judged a success. But success in war is always measured in blood, and the blood still flowed freely on Okinawa. The T3 carbines were a tactical advantage, not a strategic revolution. They saved lives in specific sectors on specific nights, but they did not change the fundamental nature of the battle. The Japanese continued to fight with suicidal determination. The Americans continued to advance yard by yard through fortified positions. The artillery continued to turn the landscape into a moonscape. The rain continued to fall. Men continued to die in large numbers from causes that had nothing to do with night vision technology. When the battle finally ended, when the last organized Japanese resistance collapsed and the island was declared secure, the T3 carbines were quietly collected. The soldiers who had used them were ordered to turn in their equipment and to report to intelligence officers for debriefing. They were reminded again that the technology was classified. They were told not to discuss it. They were told that the weapon system might be used in future operations and that operational security was paramount. Most of the soldiers complied because they were tired and because they followed orders and because they wanted to go home and forget everything about Okinawa. Hartwell turned in his T3 carbine on June 24th. He had used it for more than 2 months. He had fired approximately 160 rounds through it at targets he could see in the darkness. He had killed 39 enemy soldiers with it, more than any other T3 operator on Okinawa. He was not given a medal for this. He was not given any formal recognition. He was given a handshake and a piece of paper acknowledging that he had returned government property in acceptable condition. Then he was sent back to his unit to wait for transport off the island. The atomic bombs were dropped in August. Japan surrendered in September. The war ended. Hartwell went home to Pennsylvania. He worked in a factory. He married a woman from his town. He had children. He did not talk about the war much, and when he did not mention the T3 Carbine. The classification remained in effect. The story remained secret. He died in 1989, an old man, without ever having told the full story to anyone outside of military channels. The T3 infrared sniper system was classified for decades. Most of the weapons were destroyed after the war. A few ended up in museums, labeled only as experimental night vision carbine, with no details about their combat use. The soldiers who used them, who had seen the night turn green and who had hunted men in total darkness, mostly kept their silence. Some spoke about it later in old age after the classification was lifted, but by then the story had been overshadowed by larger narratives, by atomic weapons and Cold War technologies and the march of progress. The T3 Carbine became a footnote, a curiosity, a piece of obscure military history known primarily to specialists. But the technology survived and evolved. The principles demonstrated on Okinawa, the marriage of infrared illumination and image conversion, became the foundation for every night vision system that followed. In Korea, improved versions of the technology appeared on sniper rifles and vehicle-mounted weapons. In Vietnam, starlight scopes using passive light amplification rather than active infrared illumination gave American forces overwhelming superiority in night combat. By the Gulf War, night vision was standard equipment for frontline troops. By the War on Terror, it was ubiquitous. Modern soldiers routinely conduct operations in total darkness with a level of capability that would have seemed like science fiction to the men on Okinawa. They flip down their night vision goggles and the darkness transforms into greenlit clarity, and they move and fight and kill without the enemy being able to see them, and they do this as a matter of routine, without thinking about where the capability came from. The line of technological descent runs directly from the T3 Carbine to the modern night vision systems that define contemporary warfare. Every soldier who has ever looked through night vision goggles, every pilot who has ever flown a helicopter using thermal imaging, every special operations team that has ever assaulted a target under cover of darkness, all of them owe a debt to the experimental program that put infrared scopes in the hands of a few dozen soldiers on a muddy island in 1945. The technology that seemed like magic then is now taken for granted. The advantage that saved hundreds of lives on Okinawa has become a permanent fixture of American military dominance. But the men who first used it, who fought in that transitional moment when night vision was new and rare and almost unbelievable, they mostly disappeared into history without recognition. Their names are not taught in military academies. Their photographs do not appear in documentaries about World War II. The battles they won, the lives they saved, the nights they spent staring through greenlit scopes at enemy soldiers who never knew they were being watched. All of that was classified and compartmentalized and filed away. The secrecy that protected the technology during the war also buried the story of its use. James Hartwell was one of those men. There were others. Men from different units, different parts of the country, different backgrounds, all of them selected for night defense duty and handed a weapon that worked like something from the future. They learned to use it under fire. They learned to trust it despite its limitations. They learned to manage batteries in the rain and to scan sectors in total darkness and to shoot men who believed they were invisible. They did this work night after night, and then they went home and said nothing about it for decades, and then most of them died without the story ever being widely known. This is the cost of secrecy in war. Technology must be protected. Advantages must be concealed from the enemy. Classification serves a legitimate military purpose. But secrecy also erases stories. It erases the human beings who made the technology work, who tested it under the worst possible conditions, who turned experimental equipment into operational capability through sheer determination and courage. The men who fought with the T3 Carbine on Okinawa were not just test subjects or early adopters. They were soldiers who adapted to a new way of fighting and who used that adaptation to save lives, and their story deserves to be remembered. The night no longer belongs to anyone. Modern militaries on both sides of conflicts have access to night vision and thermal imaging and a dozen other technologies that make darkness tactically irrelevant. The advantage that the T3 Carbine provided the ability to see when the enemy could not. That advantage has been democratized and proliferated and countered. The battlefield has moved on. But there was a moment in the spring of 1945 when a small number of American soldiers could do something that seemed impossible. They could see in the dark. They could hunt in the dark. They could turn the tables on an enemy that had owned the night for years. And for a few months on one terrible island, that impossible capability made all the difference. The story of the T3 Carbine is not just a story about technology. It is a story about the human beings who use technology under extreme circumstances. It is a story about adaptability and courage and the small advantages that save lives in war. It is a story about the strange intersection of innovation and violence, about how the drive to solve tactical problems can produce tools that change the nature of combat. And it is a story about secrecy and memory, about how wars are fought not just with weapons but with information, and how the control of information can make heroes invisible even as their actions shape the future. The men who used the T3 Carbine on Okinawa are nearly all gone now. The last veterans of that battle are in their 90s or older, and with each passing year, more of them die, and more of the first-hand knowledge dies with them. The classified documents have been declassified. The photographs have been released. The technical specifications are available to researchers. But the experience, the lived reality of staring through that greenlit scope and watching enemy soldiers crawl toward you in the darkness, that is something that cannot be fully captured in documents or photographs. It can only be remembered by the men who did it, and they are disappearing. What remains is the legacy. Every night vision device in service today, from the simplest handheld scope to the most advanced helmet-mounted system, every one of them is a descendant of that bulky, battery-powered, experimental carbine that a few dozen soldiers carried into combat in 1945. The technology has improved by orders of magnitude. The weight has decreased. The power requirements have decreased. The image quality has increased. The effective range has increased. But the fundamental concept, seeing in the darkness by technological means, that concept was proven on Okinawa. The men who proved it were ordinary soldiers handed an extraordinary tool and asked to make it work under fire. They succeeded. The night would never be the same again. If you found this story compelling, if it gave you a new perspective on a forgotten piece of World War II history, please consider subscribing to this channel. Hit the like button if you think stories like this deserve to be told. And here's a question I want you to think about. Was the secrecy that surrounded the T3 Carbine justified? Did it save lives by protecting a tactical advantage? Or did it erase heroes from history and deprive them of recognition they earned? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about the balance between operational security and historical memory, and whether the men who fought with this weapon should have been acknowledged sooner. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.